What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Bush coming at you solo today with another Tale of the Tape episode. We're talking about David Bell, wide receiver from Purdue today. Again, if you guys are new to the channel, if this is the first episode of Tale of the Tape that you're watching, we have a whole playlist of other prospects. I'm going to be covering quarterbacks next week once I have my quarterback database finished for the Patreon. If you want access to that, patreon.com/fantasy stock exchange, our Dynasty rankings manifesto, Dynasty decisions, priority drawings for listener leagues, all that are benefits to being a Patreon, and tons more rookie content. But basically, like I say every episode, what we're doing is we're telling the story of David Bell in this video. We're talking about everything from his high school, freshman, sophomore, junior seasons, and painting the full picture of what David Bell can be so that you guys can know who he is by the time we get to Dynasty rookie drafts, the NFL draft, all that good stuff. So if you enjoy this video at any point, please leave a like. This video took a lot of effort to make, obviously. So if you guys do enjoy it, please hit the like button. It helps us grow, helps us out tremendously. Subscribe to the channel if you are new as well. Almost at 9,000 subscribers as I record this right now. Comment any of your thoughts down below. What do you guys think of David Bell? Where does he rank among your wide receiver rankings? But before we get into all that, let's hit the intro. Okay, so David Bell, wide receiver from the Purdue Boilermakers. This is his tale of the tape. Age 21.1 years old. As of right now, will be about 21 and a half his rookie season. 6'2", 205 pounds is what he's listed at per Purdue's website. Player Profiler also has him listed at that size as well. So in terms of his size, he's probably closer to 6 foot, I think, than 6'2". And we saw that with a guy like Rashad Bateman last year. He was listed at 6'2", 6'3", and he came in at like 6.5 feet or something like that. I think David Bell is a little bit shorter than 6'2". 200 pounds or so is probably what he weighs. We talk about basic information, background information. David Bell was a 4-star recruit, 19th wide receiver ranked in the 2019 recruiting class out of Indianapolis. Broke onto the scene at Purdue as a true freshman with over 1,000 yards receiving on 131 targets in 2019 as an 18-year-old player. And of course, for those of you guys that were following the draft last year, we know that Rondale Moore, Arizona Cardinals wide receiver, also went to Purdue. David Bell was kind of his running mate. And in 2019, his true freshman season, Rondale Moore was banged up with a bunch of injuries, and Bell basically took over as an 18-year-old true freshman. In 2020, his sophomore year, COVID-shortened season. Obviously, they only played 6 games, Purdue, and Bell averaged more yards per game and over a touchdown per game in his sophomore year, and he was more productive than Rondale Moore. Now, granted, Rondale Moore only played 3 games that year, but he was more productive on a per-game basis than Rondale Moore was. Moore off to the NFL in 2021, drafted in the 2nd round by the Arizona Cardinals. David Bell goes nuclear, 134 targets, 93 catches, 1,286 yards, 6 touchdowns with a 23.26% target share on the season, 27.45% target share in the 11 games that David Bell ended up playing out of the 13 that Purdue played overall. The big question for David Bell going into this draft process basically is, what do NFL teams view him as? Because from my experience and from what I know about the fantasy circles and what I've seen regarding David Bell, is that it looks like the fantasy community is higher on David Bell than the NFL draft community. And typically, your Todd McShay's, Daniel Jeremiah's, Mel Kiper's, they're more in tune with what the NFL is thinking, whereas us as fantasy players typically are a little bit more, incorrect when it comes to predicting draft capital. So I tend to lean towards those draft experts to look at how they view draft capital. And Todd McShay, Daniel Jeremiah, and Mel Kiper barely have this guy inside their top 10 wide receivers. Mel Kiper has him at 9. Todd McShay and Daniel Jeremiah do not have him in their top 10 wide receivers, whereas most of the fantasy community, what I think would, pretty convincingly say that this is a tier 2 wide receiver in this class. Wide receiver 4 to 7 to 8 is where most people have David Bell ranked. So the big question for him is, what's his draft capital? Is this another Tyler Johnson situation where the fantasy community is higher on a player than the NFL draft community? Is it Seth Williams from last year, who went in the 6th round, who was, by most people's standards, a day 2 wide receiver in the fantasy community? But as we always do, let's talk about the 6 fundamental traits for wide receivers. If you guys are new around here, the reason these are the 6 fundamental traits is because they are basically the basics of playing wide receiver, and they're easy to evaluate, easy to quantify, and match with metrics as well. So as I'm talking about these traits, you guys will see some film clips of David Bell that kind of exemplify the traits that I'm talking about. And the first one is separation and route running, right? If we were on a playground and I was the quarterback, who am I throwing to? It's the guy that gets open. However he gets open, whether it's, early in the route, late in the route, middle of the route, whatever the case is. With Drake London, I talked about creating separation in one of three phases of your routes. If you can do it in multiple phases, then the better route runner that you are. But with Drake London, he only did it in 2 phases, right? As opposed to 3 phases, like a guy like Garrett Wilson will do, who's a tremendous route runner, probably the best route runner in this class. At David Bell's release point versus press coverage and bump and run coverage, any kind of tight coverage whatsoever, he is very good at the release point. And then at the top of his route, when he has to, create a throwing window for his quarterback, he's very good in that aspect as well. But what you're not going to see from David Bell is, 7 yards of separation or 2 yards of separation, even like you're going to see from Garrett Wilson, who wins at all 3 phases of his route. He's probably the best route runner in this class. He's not quite that good, David Bell, but he is very solid in creating separation on short and intermediate targets, especially because that is the majority of the routes that he ran at Purdue, and it's what he excelled at. Now, when you look at the metrics, he ranked 10th in this class in PFF receiving grade with an 86.9 receiving grade, according to PFF. Ranks about middle of the class with a 2.7 yards per route run, 114.5 QBR when targeted. Now, I think he's a little bit raw in this area, could use some refinement and nuance to his routes, but a good framework for a great route runner in the NFL, in my opinion. I think he has, tremendous ceiling in this area. And if he can become a better route runner at the next level, and I think he's already, an 8 out of 10 type of route runner for a prospect, he could definitely shoot his way up, fantasy draft boards, come his second and third season in the NFL after his rookie year, which might take him a little bit more time to develop. Now, when we get into the second category, which is hands, once you get open, you got to catch the ball. You got to, hold on through tough contact. Your hands need to be an asset to your game. And in my opinion, this is David Bell's calling card. His hands are his best attribute as a wide receiver. He snags balls out of the air with ease. You're going to see a number of clips of him making highlight reel catch after highlight reel catch, catches that most receivers probably aren't going to make, even in the NFL, let alone in college. Now, the only drops that I saw from him were ball tracking related on really deep routes downfield. Now, pretty much anything 20 yards in is his. If you throw it up for David Bell 20 yards in, it is his ball. He's coming down with it. Contested catch rate wasn't very high when you look at the metrics, 42% per the metrics. But for the life of me, I didn't see a single catch 20 yards in where he didn't come down with it. It was more so those routes that were more downfield. And that's going to be, an underlying theme of this entire video, is that this guy isn't a guy that is going to win at all 3 levels of the field. He is very much a short and intermediate type of wide receiver, which, from a fantasy perspective means he's got a bit lower of a ceiling. He doesn't have a Jamar Chase level ceiling from a dynasty perspective per se, but it is, a guy that can be very productive in the NFL nonetheless. Now, getting into yards after catch, this is a guy that can provide a good spark after the catch. Once you get the ball in his hands, he's able to make something, with it. He can, make people miss. He can break tackles, things like that. He's not going to be Treylon Burks after the catch, who in my opinion is the best after the catch wide receiver in this class by any stretch, but he is very effective at creating additional yardage consistently. And that's the important part, I think, with David Bell, because he's a possession receiver, short and intermediate target. We don't need him to break off 70-yard touchdowns on slant routes because, number one, he doesn't have the athleticism to do that, which I'll talk about in a second. And number two, he isn't a guy that needs to do that because his job is to move the chains. His job is to create first downs, make his quarterback's life easier. And if you can throw him a 5-yard hitch route, break a tackle, and get a 15-yard gain out of it, then he's doing his job. And that's going to help us out for fantasy once he gets to the NFL. Now, 536 yards of his nearly 1,300 receiving yards total came after the catch in 2021. Good for about 42% of his yards coming after the catch. Now, that's a pretty good number, like I said, for the type of role that he has. And especially considering his role was not to stretch the field. His role is not to be, Jamison Williams or Drake London or, Treylon Burks or any of these guys that are going to work more downfield. 25 avoided tackles after the catch, nearly 27% of his total catches. He was able to break a tackle after those catches. And that's third in the class, only behind Sky Moore and Garrett Wilson. And Garrett Wilson and him are pretty similar in this category. They're both possession receivers that can do something after the catch. Now, number 4 is usage, where they win downfield, slot, design touches. How are they going to impact the game at the next level? And again, this will all tie into his biggest weakness, which in my opinion, his biggest weakness as a player is he's not going to be getting a 3-level threat type of role in the NFL. I think he is well suited for a short to intermediate role in the NFL. He can get some work done downfield, his ability to secure tough catches through heavy contact was very evident in some of his plays that were downfield, but only 18.7% of his 134 targets, so 25 of those targets came 20 plus yards downfield. And most of those long bomb touchdowns that you'll see in some of David Bell's highlight tapes came against subpar competition. He wasn't doing that against the Michigan States and the Ohio States that he played on his schedule. He was more so doing that against Connecticut and some shittier teams. So in terms of the NFL caliber competition, he performed at a very, very high level. You guys will see his averages against NFL caliber competition. It's very, very impressive. But what we didn't see from him was that 3-level usage against NFL caliber competition. He was getting most of his damage done after the catch and in the short to intermediate game. His deep speed is definitely a question mark for me. The one area that I think Bell's biggest weakness is similar to, and a player that we saw last year come out, was Amon-Ra St. Brown. And Amon-Ra St. Brown is not a 3-level threat in the NFL. He was still able to be productive for fantasy despite not being a 3-level threat in the NFL or in college. And I think the Amon-Ra St. Brown framework for David Bell is what we're looking at in terms of his pro projection. He's very good in those short to intermediate routes and design touches if you want to give him some. He just isn't going to win downfield consistently. He'll have a couple downfield plays here and there, but he played over 80% of his routes from the X alignment, and he was used as his team's possession receiver. I think also if an NFL team wanted to deploy him as a big slot or a slot receiver in general, I definitely think he could succeed in that role, similar to what we saw from Amon-Ra in Detroit. Now, number 5, athleticism. How do you win in terms of your athletic ability? And on film, you'll notice that David Bell just doesn't have a top gear, right? It's the one thing missing from his game. It kind of ties all together with the fact that he isn't able to affect the downfield game. I don't expect David Bell to run much faster than mid to low 4.5s at the combine in a couple weeks. Agility wise, vertical jump wise, he should be solid. He's definitely a good athlete. He just doesn't have the natural speed to get you very, very excited about his film. He doesn't have, the natural speed that's going to get a lot of people excited watching his highlight tape. He's basically a slightly worse version of Garrett Wilson across the board, except he has slightly better hands than Garrett Wilson. But when you talk about route running, he's a little bit worse than Garrett Wilson. Yards after catch, a little bit worse than Garrett Wilson. Hands, a little bit better. Athleticism, a little bit worse. Downfield ability, a little bit worse than Garrett Wilson. So we're basically talking about a B+ version of Garrett Wilson on the surface level. Now, the final thing that we're going to talk about here, the 6th fundamental trait of a wide receiver in college, basically that we're scouting for the NFL draft, is their analytics profile. How did they produce in college? And like I said, the paper nerds are going to love David Bell because his production is very good. His analytics profile is very good as well. And like I said earlier in the video, he produced at a high level as a true freshman 18-year-old, good for a 18.7 breakout age, which is a popular metric that many, fantasy analysts who dive into the numbers use. 94th percentile, third only to Drake London and George Pickens in this draft class. 29.9% college target share. In 2020, when Rondell Moore was on the field for some of those games, 27.45% in the 11 games that he played this season as well. College dominator at 35.1% in the 69th percentile. So this is a guy across the board analytically checks all the boxes. The only problem with David Bell's profile analytically is the fact that he has a 25th percentile yards per reception of 12.8 yards. So again, I talked about his role being a short to intermediate target. The yards per reception metric is kind of underutilized by analytics heads in general because typically it points to players that can affect all 3 levels of the field. And if you have a low yards per reception, like I've said kind of throughout this video, you're going to be limited to a short to intermediate threat in the NFL, which again points back to Bell being a guy that didn't do much work downfield. Now, the subjective traits, again, those are the 6 fundamental traits that we can quantify that are easy to evaluate. These subjective traits like nuance, smarts, toughness, they're really in the eye of the beholder, whoever's watching the film, in this case, me. Some of the subjective traits for David Bell that I saw were that he's definitely a raw player. I think he could use some coaching, some NFL caliber coaching at the next level, which is fine. He's a young receiver. He's only 21 years old. Tough and physical, right? You definitely love to see that, especially when the ball is in the air at the catch point. He's very tough. He's very physical. When you watch him, run blocking, he's very tough. He's very physical. After the catch, tough, physical. That's what you want to see from a young receiver because that's that dog mentality that we love from our wide receivers, some of the best receivers in the NFL. The reason that they can be divas at times is because they have that dog mentality. And the one trait that stands out for me as a subjective trait that I think David Bell has in spades is just his smarts, his awareness. And especially against zone coverage. I think he's a very, very intelligent player at finding soft spots in zone. When I was watching him, you're going to see a clip against Iowa of him crossing over the middle of the field, settling down in his zone coverage and, making the play. That's why he's going to be a good short to intermediate threat at the next level, is because that's the type of thing that is going to be asked of him if he's a slot receiver or if he's a guy that has, an average depth of target of 10 yards in the NFL. So he's very, very good in this regard. Now let's move on to final grades. Now, after all this, how does he stack up against the rest of the class? How does he stack up against last year's class? If you guys are curious, 886.25 out of 1,100, the scale of 1,100 that I grade on, is what his final grade ended up being. And that's basically good for an early to mid second round talent. This is a guy that I think can be productive in the NFL, just isn't going to have the, superstar ceiling of a Treylon Burks or a Drake London or even a Garrett Wilson, in my opinion. He is comfortably my wide receiver 4 that I have graded right now. So I haven't graded Jameson Williams or Chris Olave or some of these other players. Those will be coming, in the coming weeks. I'll have tail of the tapes on those players. By the time we get to March after the combine, I should have all of the major, top 2 round, dynasty rookie picks consensus wise graded. But as of right now, he's my wide receiver 4 that I've graded. He is comfortably behind Drake London, Treylon Burks, and Garrett Wilson as a tier 2 wide receiver. In terms of where he would have ranked last year, my top 5 wide receivers were Jamar Chase, Devontae Smith, Elijah Moore, Jalen Waddle, and Rashad Bateman. Those were the 5 receivers I had first round grades on last year, but just ahead of De'Ami Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown, who were my wide receivers 6 and 7, who I had late second round grades on. So I had 5 receivers with first round grades, a couple guys with late second round grades, and then mostly third round and fourth round wide receivers after that. So I saw a pretty big gap between those top 5 and the next group of wide receivers. If David Bell were to have been last year's class, then he would have been in his own tier, really, of a tier 2 wide receiver behind those top 5 guys. And the big question for me is, where does this guy go in the NFL draft? As I said earlier in the video, as long as he gets picked in the top 100 overall picks, meaning he's a first, second, third rounder in the NFL draft, this should end up being a tier 2 wide receiver for me, along with Jameson Williams and Chris Olave and, Jahan Dotson, some other guys that could fit into their tier 2 area of wide receivers. I haven't watched them yet, so I haven't graded them. I don't know where they stack up amongst each other, but I'm imagining, just based on what I know about those players, that David Bell will be in that range with those guys at some point. And again, come March, April, I'll have all this, ready to go, and you'll know exactly how I think about these players, but I have to watch them, 5 games at a time each to get that full formed opinion. And a comparable player, so pro comparisons for David Bell, my comp for him is Jarvis Landry. And Jarvis Landry, that might sound like a bad comp to you guys. You might be like, Jarvis Landry, what kind of ceiling does that give you? But if you think about Miami Dolphins, Jarvis Landry, the ceiling type projection that you can expect for David Bell, Landry is definitely older now and less productive than he used to be with the Dolphins. But when he was with the Dolphins, he had 3 straight top 15 PPR points per game seasons from 2015 to 2017. And in 2017, he finishes the wide receiver 5 in points per game. Now, granted, it was a down year for wide receivers. He only had like 16.5 points per game. But either way, this was a guy that was productive. Both players excel in short to intermediate areas of the field. Both players have really good hands. The hands are the best attribute of Jarvis Landry, the best attribute of David Bell. And both guys have a complete skill set, but don't have the ceiling athleticism that you wanted to see. And I believe Jarvis Landry only ran like a 4.6 40. I think David Bell might be a slightly better athlete than Jarvis Landry was, but that's kind of the projection that I'm looking at for David Bell. And I know Jarvis Landry is primarily a slot receiver, but he can play on the outside, which is how I think of David Bell at the next level. I actually almost comped David Bell to Odell Beckham Jr., but I think that's probably a little too lofty considering Odell Beckham Jr. is just a much better athlete than David Bell. So I wasn't comfortable making that connection. So instead I went to his LSU teammate who also has great hands, also was productive in those areas of the field, and also pretty much do everything well, but nothing exceptional, which is exactly what I think of David Bell. Now, best fits in terms of what scheme, what team we want to see him go to. I think the universal scheme fit that David Bell is, because I think he can play the X. I think he can play a big slot role. He can't really play a flanker role because he's not a good enough athlete. You want to use like a Rondell Moore type in that kind of role, but the best teams that make sense for him in terms of his skill set would probably be the New Orleans Saints. If they retain Michael Thomas, they could use David Bell on the outside as their true X wide receiver. Chargers, if Mike Williams is gone, I think David Bell could definitely fill a role in that offense. The New York Jets alongside Elijah Moore would make a lot of sense. The Atlanta Falcons, if Calvin Ridley moves on and they wanted to replace him with David Bell in the second round alongside Kyle Pitts, that would make a lot of sense. If they wanted to bring him in to complement Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller in Las Vegas, or if they wanted to bring him in to complement Devontae Adams in Green Bay. I do think he'd benefit from being the 1B in an offense, or even if he's behind a tight end like Darren Waller or Kyle Pitts as the 1A wide receiver, but the 1B target. I think that would make a whole lot of sense for David Bell at the next level. But I do think he still could carve out a role as a number 1 wide receiver in the NFL. I just think it would probably be easier if he was the number 2 in his offense. So that's everything I have to say about David Bell. Again, this is a second round type of wide receiver for me, a guy in terms of rookie drafts that I'm looking to be drafting in the late first round of rookie drafts, probably in that 110 to 112 area, if I can help it. Let me know what you guys think of David Bell in the comment section down below. Do you think I'm maybe too low on him, maybe too high on him? Who do you guys like over David Bell that I haven't watched yet? Let me know who you want to see next in terms of the next tail of the tape. We're going to have Jameson Williams coming at you on Friday. And then next week, I'm going to try and cover some quarterbacks, because now we're starting to get an idea and a framework for what quarterbacks are coveted highly by the NFL, what quarterbacks are going to go high in the NFL draft. And I wanted to wait on quarterbacks because I didn't know how the NFL teams thought about them. And now with the combine approaching, Senior Bowl already in the books, we're starting to get an idea that Malik Willis is going to go high. Kenny Pickett's going to go high. Matt Corral is going to go high. Sam Howell's a guy that people think is going to go high as well. So that's what I'm going to cover in the next couple of weeks, is the quarterback position. So let me know down below what you enjoyed. Like the video if you enjoyed as well. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. Check out the Patreon if you got any value from this video and you want to support the channel. Patreon.com/Fantasy Stock Exchange. Link is in the description for that. A bunch of other links in the description if you want to help out our sponsors at Underdog, promo code FSE. If you want to book a consultation with us, there's a Google form in the description as well. Peace out, guys. I'll talk to you soon.